Hi everybody, thanks so much for joining us again. We're back with episode 13 of our Dissemination Day series. Going into the new year, we decided to focus on some of the sort of well-known articles that talk about conceptual understanding of what positive behaviour support is and what challenging behaviour is. So I'm starting off in this session by looking at quite a well-known article by Hastings and another number of his colleagues that was published in the International Journal of Positive Behaviour Support back in 2013. That was a special edition of the Journal of Positive Behaviour Support, and there'll be a number of other articles within that we might cover during these sessions. So this particular article is titled A Conceptual Framework for Understanding Why Challenging Behaviour Occurs in People with Developmental Disabilities. So this article is a little bit different to some of the other articles that we've reviewed during this series because it's more of a conceptual paper. It's not actually focusing on a specific study with participants and methods and that sort of thing. It's an informal review of the literature combined with the researchers' very significant experiences in this area. They talk about the fact that it's motivated by a need to create some kind of framework with which to understand the problem at hand. Why do these behaviours occur in the first place? Why do we need positive behaviour support? They speak about the importance of actually understanding the origins of the problem to therefore lead into developing interventions that are informed by this. So this study wasn't a systematic review as such. It was more of a general formulation from the literature and from the experiences of the researchers, and it provides a context for later articles within the journal that we might be reviewing a little bit later on. Probably most famously the Gore et al. Article that talks about the 10 key components of positive behaviour support. Early on in this article, the authors talk about the importance of understanding challenging behaviour as a social construction, and they cite the well-known definition developed by Emerson and Einfeld, which defines challenging behaviour as culturally abnormal behaviour of such intensity, frequency or duration that the physical safety of the person or others is likely to be placed in serious jeopardy, or behaviour which is likely to seriously limit use of or result in the person being denied access to ordinary community facilities. There's a lot of elements within that definition, and the point that they sort of pull out is that so many of those elements are socially constructed. Culturally abnormal behaviour is obviously one particular part of that definition, that's a social construct, but they also talk about the fact that many of the outcomes of challenging behaviour are clear social consequences. So harm to the person or others, exclusion from typical community living, can all be defined in terms of their impact socially. And so often we find that challenging behaviour is actually defined by the impact that it has on the person or on others. And the authors focus in this article on building up a much clearer picture of all the elements that have an impact on challenging behaviour developing, and not merely focusing on the impact of that behaviour. So let's look now at the framework that was developed. I'll pop it up on the screen for you now. There's a lot going on. We're going to break each element of this down, so hopefully by the end of it you'll really understand what all of these things mean, how they interact to develop and maintain challenging behaviour. As you see on the far right of the screen, we have our impact, the impact that challenging behaviour has. And as I've just said, there's so much more to challenging behaviour than its impact. So we're going to be looking at the vulnerabilities and the maintaining processes, and as I say, I'll break them down for you one by one. So the authors talk about the fact that there are a number of both biological and psychosocial factors that have been identified through research as vulnerabilities or risk factors for challenging behaviour. These factors are part of the context in which challenging behaviours start to emerge for people. So these again can be broken down into a few more different categories, but if we look at the biological vulnerabilities first, sensory impacts, so things like hearing impairments, sensory differences, people who have hyper or hyposensitivities to different sensory input will have a big impact on whether that person is going to be engaging in challenging behaviour. So for example, if someone has a hearing impairment that hasn't been diagnosed and isn't being addressed, then that's likely to be having an impact on the way that person is interacting with their environment and behaving. Physical health, particular physical health complaints that lead to pain are likely to lead to an increase in behaviours that might challenge if they're not addressed. And it's really best practice to be, when we're seeing a change in somebody's behaviour or an increase in somebody's challenging behaviour, addressing those physical needs, giving that person a checkup to properly understand whether or not there's something going on in terms of physical health. Genetic vulnerabilities also come into the category of biological. Some syndromes or disorders might have a higher likelihood of leading to that person developing specific types of challenging behaviour. So research has found, for example, that people who have Fragile X syndrome are more likely to engage in self-injurious behaviour. People with Prader-Willi, for example, would be more likely to engage in behaviour such as pica, picking up things and putting them in their mouths. And people with a syndrome named Cornelia de Lange syndrome, which was the example that's given in the research paper, would be more likely to engage in self-injurious behaviour. Fourthly, I've added medication within the biological vulnerabilities. We know that we support a lot of people who take a wide range of different forms of medication, all of which can have quite nasty side effects, which could then have an impact going forward on that person's behaviour. So side effects such as sedation, headaches, depression, agitation, and long-term physical health effects that might come from taking medication for a prolonged period of time. So all of those vulnerabilities that might lead to challenging behaviour being more likely to occur, it's not saying within that model that if that person has physical health needs, then they are definitely going to engage in challenging behaviour. It just makes that person vulnerable, more likely to engage in challenging behaviour. So alongside the biological vulnerabilities, there are a number of psychosocial vulnerabilities that are also linked with challenging behaviour occurring. The first one that we'll talk about here are the negative life events that a number of people with developmental disabilities might experience. And there's research evidence cited within this article that talks about the fact that there's a link between cumulative negative life events and higher rates of challenging behaviour. And when we talk about negative life events, we could talk about things like trauma, abuse, we could talk about bereavement, but also it focuses on people moving from service to service regularly, people having high staff turnovers, so lots of changes in the staff team, losing lots of people that they've built relationships with. Those are also classed within the category of negative life events. And certainly sort of going forward, we're focusing more and more within this sector on trauma-informed support. So having an understanding of the negative life events that the people we're supporting might have been through and how we need to amend their support accordingly. Limited communication skills are also included here as a psychosocial vulnerability. This is understandable because if that person isn't able to communicate their needs using another means, then they're more likely to use challenging behaviour to meet those needs instead. Impoverished social networks, something that's likely to be linked with that person's ability to communicate and to go out and form those networks themselves. But if that person doesn't have a network around them, then they're more likely to feel isolated, they're more vulnerable to abusive practices or poor treatment, and they're also more vulnerable to depression, something that's linked in itself to challenging behaviour. This is similar to lack of meaningful activity, again something that's listed here as a vulnerability. If that person isn't engaged in regular meaningful activities that are tailored around that person, that are based around that person's interests and passions, then they're more likely to be diagnosed with depression. And again, there's a link with communication and there's a link with social networks there as well. The final psychosocial vulnerability that's listed here are mental health conditions and issues. And again, all of these interlink and intertwine because we know that if that person's got no social network and isn't doing anything they're enjoying, then they're more vulnerable to mental health conditions anyway. And we see in the evidence that there is a link between mental health conditions like depression and higher rates of challenging behaviour. So going back to our model here, we can see on the left where our biological and psychosocial vulnerabilities sit, and see here how we've got this cyclical nature of the model, where the impact, the exclusion, the harm to the person, the harm to others around that person, all of those things are likely to lead to greater vulnerabilities. So, for example, if that person is becoming physically aggressive to people, is being kept from going out into the community and engaging with people and forming social networks, that's a vulnerability in itself that can lead to increased rates of challenging behaviour. So it's important to understand the cyclical nature of this particular model. So the authors talk about the importance of also understanding the maintaining processes that are having an impact on challenging behaviour continuing. They talk about the importance of not only focusing on the vulnerabilities and the impact, but also focusing on these maintaining processes. Because if they weren't actually occurring in the first place, then why would that person be engaging in challenging behaviour when you consider the nature of the impact of that behaviour? So that challenging behaviour must be useful in some way for that person. So this section of the model is where we first start sort of talking about and understanding the importance of behavioural function. When we talk about function, what we mean is the purpose that behaviour serves for the individual. So within the model, the authors talk about the maintaining processes being pain reduction and also being other people's behaviour. So we'll look at those in turn. In terms of pain reduction, it's not necessarily as simple as just alleviating pain. It could also be thinking about alleviating some kind of internal distress, potentially linked to sort of sensory discomfort. But also there is evidence that people, for example, who engage in self-injurious behaviour might do that to release an endorphin that eases pain that they might be experiencing. So that's one potential function for that person's challenging behaviour. Other functions might be linked to other people's behaviour, so the other people around that person. We might see the maintaining processes being accessing interaction from the people around that person, accessing tangibles, so objects or items that person wants, escaping or avoiding some forms of interaction, escaping or avoiding demands or difficult environments linked to other people's behaviour, and also that providing of stimulation. So when we're looking at behaviour that maybe has a more sensory function, that person might be more likely to engage in that behaviour if they're in an environment that is lacking in stimulation. Again, something that's linked to the behaviour of people around that individual. It's important to understand when we're talking about behavioural function that it's not necessarily always as clear-cut as one behaviour serving one function. Functions might vary depending on the context, depending on the people that are around them, depending on the situation, and also several behaviours may have the same function. So it can sometimes be a slightly more complicated process to actually ascertain what need, what purpose that behaviour is serving. But really important to have an understanding that all behaviour does meet a need, does serve a purpose for that person. One really interesting factor that's focused on within this model, again something that I really like about it, is the importance of understanding the impact that other people have on challenging behaviour developing and being maintained. Other people provide the context in which challenging behaviour occurs, and that links back to the vulnerabilities that we spoke about, and it's crucial to understanding the functions of the behaviour. So really interestingly, this paper focuses on the things that might influence that carer or support worker behaviour, with an understanding that has such a major impact on the likelihood of challenging behaviour occurring. We've got here another really neat little model that's included within the paper that talks about those particular influences and breaks them down into several different categories. First of all, looking at the beliefs and attitudes of those carers or support workers. This could be around that person maybe not having an accurate picture of what actually is going on, why challenging behaviour is occurring, which is quite understandable because when you look at what we've looked at up to now within this little presentation, there are a lot of elements that lead to challenging behaviour occurring. There's lots of vulnerabilities, there's lots of different potential maintaining processes. So it's understandable that support workers aren't always completely on the ball in terms of understanding why behaviour is occurring. And this can sometimes lead to sort of attributions occurring, to sort of more negative attitudes around why that behaviour is occurring. That's where beliefs and attitudes are so important, because those attitudes are going to have an impact on the way in which that person is supporting that individual, and therefore will have an impact on the level of challenging behaviour. So, for example, you might sometimes find staff teams saying, oh, they're just doing that for attention. They're just doing that for attention. Whereas actually, if you explored it in more detail, there might be something going on in the environment from which they want to escape or to avoid something that's coming up. You also sometimes might find staff teams talking about behaviours just coming out of the blue and ignoring the fact that actually all behaviour serves some sort of purpose or has some sort of function. And all of this, as I say, is completely understandable when you look at the complexity of the nature of challenging behaviour. So another area that's focused on in terms of influences on carer behaviour is the emotional impact that challenging behaviour is going to have. And I think that's really great, actually, that is focused upon within this model, because it's something that's so often sort of brushed aside. But challenging behaviour is tough. It's tough to deal with. It's tough to experience every day for carers and for family members. All of our behaviour serves a function, and staff members may be engaging in some behaviour, interacting in certain ways to avoid that challenging behaviour. And that maybe isn't necessarily the best way to be supporting that person, but they're doing what they can to avoid what's happening, to avoid that challenge. Stress levels also need to be taken into account. I've been a support worker. I know what it can be like, particularly when you're going into a situation where you know that challenging behaviour is highly likely to occur or is occurring repetitively. It's about those stress levels are going to have an impact on the way that you respond and react in that situation. So it's about taking all of that into account, and I think it's really important that this has been considered within this model, that those emotional influences are going to be having an effect on carer behaviour and therefore a knock-on effect on the challenging behaviour of the people they're supporting. Moving out through this model, so we've looked at the beliefs and attitudes and the emotions that might have an influence on staff members, on family carers' behaviour. The wider context, we're now looking at the culture of that family or working environment is going to have a huge impact on the levels of challenging behaviour. So, it's really important to consider, getting the culture right before we can actually go in with more focused interventions. Accepted ways of doing things, certain individuals who are seen as leaders and perhaps might guide a particular direction that's maybe a little aversive, is maybe not the best in terms of dealing with that person's challenging behaviour. The competing demands within that context as well, thinking about what actually the priorities are within that context and whether they're the right priorities in terms of supporting people to be engaging in meaningful activities and to be building those social networks and having their health needs addressed and all of those other things that sort of address challenging behaviour. And then all of this sits within the wider societal and policy context. And forgive the crude sort of illustrations within this model. I just wanted to sort of make it clear to you guys, what we're talking about. All of it is encompassed within the wider society and the wider sort of policy, that broader social context, those general sort of societal attitudes that are going to be having some influence on what carers do, when they respond to challenging behaviour, what the priorities are, again, within society, the focus on health and safety being paramount, the focus on sort of reducing risk, and perhaps some of the sort of financial barriers as well that are wider than just the sort of the smaller culture. So going back to the model, hopefully what I've gone through over the last few slides has hopefully helped you to understand what this model is about, the importance of understanding that there are vulnerabilities that are going to be having an impact on whether challenging behaviour occurs, the maintaining processes that it's really important to understand for each individual, and the impact and the way that feeds back into the vulnerabilities in that very sort of cyclical manner. So hopefully you've got a sort of good understanding of that particular model. I really like it as a way of understanding challenging behaviour and as a way of understanding what our priorities need to be in terms of positive behaviour support. So we'll talk a little bit now about the implications. First of all, the authors talk about the need to focus on social, environmental and psychological factors. For too long, maybe there's been a little bit too much of a focus on medical approaches, on the use of medication, those sort of more aversive approaches. And that actually, if we can address some of those social, environmental, psychological factors, things as simple as making sure that people have the best possible communication tools, that the people have the access to the activities that they enjoy and the social networks around them, how those are actually going to be the most effective interventions for most people in terms of reducing challenging behaviour. Secondly, the stress, the importance of context. So within this model, there's a lot of talk about the context in which challenging behaviour occurs, understanding other people's behaviour and the impact that will have on challenging behaviour. And intervention not simply being about focusing on behaviour, but focusing on the wider context. The authors highlight the importance of addressing vulnerabilities that might make challenging behaviour more likely. Interventions targeting vulnerabilities to reduce the likelihood of challenging behaviour occurring. So again, going in there with enriched environments, with communication tools, with quality of life, sort of anything that enriches quality of life for that person, and addressing potential health issues. So some of the things we might sort of class as antecedent interventions, things that prevent that behaviour from occurring in the first place. And it all sort of fits into the category of being proactive, being as proactive as possible, taking a preventative approach rather than simply being reactive all of the time. Another point that they pull out within this article is the importance of using the science of behaviour, so applied behaviour analysis. And they talk about that as being the core of positive behaviour support. Is not an optional extra. So we need to be making sure that we're using functional analyses, that we're using, interventions that are based on the science of behaviour. Obviously, making sure that you get the right professional in to support you with that. A sort of more wider sort of understanding around this this particular model is it focuses on the fact that positive behaviour support is a broad and systems-based approach. Positive behaviour support isn't an intervention in itself. It's a system-wide support. And I think the way that this model is laid out, actually, there's a lot of areas that PBS needs to address. PBS needs to address the context. It needs to address those wider societal demands that are having an impact on challenging behaviour developing. It's not simply the sort of person-specific, interventions that are based on applied behaviour analysis, although obviously that is part of positive behaviour support. PBS should target a range of outcomes, not only challenging behaviour. So that's something that I feel really passionate about. We shouldn't just be focusing on reducing challenging behaviour, reducing restrictive practices. We want those to be an outcome, but the most important thing is that that person is living the best possible quality of life, and that the reductions in challenging behaviour are a sort of side effect of that increase in quality of life. So that's really, really important as well. Hopefully this has all made perfect sense to you guys, and you found it as interesting as I have. I think it's a really good sort of model to get an understanding of in terms of building your knowledge around positive behaviour support, and I hope that the following sessions are going to sort of build on this particular presentation to sort of help you have a clearer understanding of what PBS is and how it can be used to support people to have the best possible quality of life. So thank you so much for listening. Have a good rest of your day, and I'll speak to you all soon. Bye.